Welcome, everyone. So we will be spending the next few hours talking about investigator-initiated trials, getting investigators to appreciate their responsibilities both as investigators and as sponsors. What we'll be talking about today is defining an investigator-initiated trial, review the applicable federal regulations for IITs, including sponsor and investigator responsibilities, look at the steps involved in initiating an IIT with the sponsor, and review regulatory reporting requirements. We'll also discuss trial master files and the importance of keeping those essential documents in a central location for investigator-initiated studies, looking at DIA TMF reference model. So we've had some updates in that model, and we anticipate that we will get another version here shortly within this year. We'll also look at approaches to minimize risks associated with investigator-initiated trials by looking at the common pitfalls that the FDA has seen when they come out and done their inspection of these types of studies. And there has been a focus in the last several years on investigator-initiated studies. So if you have access to that green check, how many of you have had an FDA inspection of your investigator-initiated studies? Okay, all right, some of you have. All right, so hopefully things went well. We're going to look at some warning letters, too, to investigators who kind of blurred the line between investigator-initiated and sponsor-initiated studies, and kind of forgetting that they were indeed the sponsor. So federal regulations for investigator-initiated trials are pretty much the same for what we would see for investigators and for sponsors. So we look at these studies in terms of ensuring that we have met those obligations. There are really no shortcuts for using this type of approach for an investigator-initiated study. As a matter of fact, the reason that the FDA has been so focused on these is the concern that without having oversight and monitoring from maybe a sponsor or a CRO group, that these things are not happening. And we do see that actually in the warning letters written to many of these investigator sponsors or sponsor investigators, that we do unfortunately see where there hasn't been monitoring, or the monitoring has not been sufficient, or the monitors are not qualified to provide that monitoring. So one quick question I wanted to ask before we get started up is, again, if you have access to that green check, or you can type it in the chat panel, how many of you are familiar with the FDA's Compliance Program Guidance Manual? I know some of you are, 7348.811, on how the FDA will inspect a clinical investigator and a sponsor investigator. Yeah, Heidi, I knew you knew that. How about the rest of you? Anybody else? Because we can make sure we send that out. So really it's the FDA's SOP, if you will, on how they will conduct these types of inspections, the things they'll be looking for. And it's really critical that we look at this in terms of, are we established to be able to meet this scrutiny that the FDA would bring to an investigator-initiated study. So let me write a note to myself, and I'll make sure I send that to Heidi so that that will go out to everyone. And Heidi, you'll get an extra copy. So when we look at a sponsor investigator, it is an individual, organization, or institution that assumes responsibility for initiating, conducting, managing, and or financing a clinical trial, a clinical investigation. So you might have a manufacturer that is going to provide product for you, and they might actually even provide some funding. But the clinical investigator, the sponsor investigator who came up with this idea, who wants to test this product maybe in a new way, then you would be responsible for the sponsor responsibilities. And we'll talk about this. We cannot blur that line between manufacturer and sponsor investigator, because the FDA is concerned that sponsors, traditional sponsors in terms of manufacturers and studiers of that product, are using investigator-initiated studies to circumvent the requirements for full studies under an IND or an IDE. Sponsor investigator is defined under 21 CFR 312 as an individual who initiates and conducts an investigation, and under whose immediate direction the investigational product is administered or dispensed. So the requirements applicable to a sponsor investigator under this part include both those applicable to a sponsor and an investigator. And we know we struggle to get investigators to follow investigator responsibilities. And it is a shock for some of them that they are also responsible for sponsor responsibilities. And we see, and you might have seen this as well, we'll see where an investigator might take a protocol from another company and just populate it with the language for the product that they want to use and not really think about the body of the protocol. And as an auditor, I have audited multiple investigator-initiated studies and worked with groups to establish investigator-initiated study programs for oversight. And unfortunately, we see where, as I said, protocols are cannibalized, if you will, but investigators, sponsor investigators, haven't read those protocols in detail. So they hold themselves accountable to things that they can't support. So that's kind of the shortcut method. But even investigators that really sit down and think through their protocol, write that protocol, get it approved, don't always appreciate that they're responsible for both sides of that equation.